You are listening to Radio Free Signs of the Times, broadcasting into the heart of an occupied America.
Welcome to this week's Signs of the Times podcast. I'm Henry.
I'm Joe.
And I'm Scott.
We are here this week with our special guest, Richard Dolan, the author of UFOs in the National Security State. Volume 1 of Rich's book covered the years 1941 to 1973, and he is currently writing his second volume that will bring the story up to date. Maybe we'll be able to get a little glimpse of some of the things that he'll be in talking about in that book. We came across Rich's work back in 2001, 2002, and we were pretty amazed by what he had been able to come up with. And we've been wanting to get a hold of him for several years, and we've finally been able to do it. So, hi, Rich.
Hi, Henry, Joe, Scott. Thank you for having me here.
So you weren't involved or weren't interested in UFOs when you began your research, were you?
Not particularly. I grew up with what I think would be an average level of interest in this topic compared with most people. In other words, I wasn't really a hardcore believer and I wasn't a skeptic. I had an interest as a child from having seen a few In Search of episodes with Leonard Nimoy. I remember thinking, that's a cool show. And grew up like everybody else with shows like Star Trek and that sort of thing. But I never really thought in any serious way about the UFO phenomenon. I went through undergraduate and then graduate school, focusing on political history primarily, and history and philosophy and literature. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s, I was doing graduate work in history at the University of Rochester, a lot of Cold War studies, at which time this question hit me. And it was a very conservative question. I was in a bookstore with my wife, and I chanced across Timothy Good's very excellent book, Above Top Secret, subtitled The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. I remember this very well. It was 1993, 94. This book was staring me right in the face, and I picked it up, and I thought, oh, wow, cool. I remember flipping through the book, seeing names that I recognized, CIA directors and military and generals and so on, people, some of whose diaries I had studied, like James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense.
Because at the time your interest was in the Cold War.
Absolutely.
And the national security
right.
state.
But here is Timothy Good dropping names and departments that I had studied, but in a completely different context. And and I had this feeling immediately of what I've occasionally called schizophrenic society, a schizophrenic culture, where there's an official truth, and the official truth is none of this stuff is real, all of it's nonsense. And then you find seemingly very intelligent, well-informed, serious people who do take it seriously. And everybody in the course of their life has come across claims by high-level military people or alleged insiders who have taken UFOs seriously. So I had this crystallized moment in my life in which I just asked myself, I really want to know if this is a serious topic or not. Because if it is serious, then why have I not read about it in any academic history book ever? Even if it was a mistake. Even if you go back to 1950 and you discover that a 3-star general was really worried about UFOs as something unexplained, would it not be interesting to go back to that moment, to be a fly on the wall of that general's office and find out why he would be taking it seriously? How could that not be interesting in the context of the Cold War and so on? And so that was really my very conservative entry point into this field. I just didn't want to know what are UFOs necessarily. I just wanted to know, was it a valid historical topic? And that turned out to be the kind of crowbar by which I pried my way into this field.
And then how long did it take you to go from there to realizing that, yes, there was something there and it might be something that is fairly important.
Not particularly long, to tell you the truth. What happened was I picked up Timothy Good's book and I read it, and I remembered thinking, wow, can this be true? Can that be true? Could there have been a Portuguese Air Force encounter with a UFO that actually did that? Could there have been this U.S. military encounter? In other words, it was one military encounter after another that really got my attention. Could this director of scientific intelligence for the CIA really have said that to his boss, that this phenomenon involves a truly unexplained, phenomenon that doesn't involve any known technology? Statements that are just really out there, but that seemed to be true, and it turns out were true. So within a few months, I was deep into it. What had started out as a personal pet side project kept growing and growing. And one thing that I did early on was I started taking very methodical notes. Every source, every book that I read, I essentially extracted a chronological database. So I'd go through each book, check off a fact of interest, and put it down in my file.
Your
each
background as a historian coming out.
Exactly.
There.
And then each new datum that I thought was important, I put in chronological order. And the real thing that saved me was that I cited each one. Mm-hmm. So everything was annotated and cited. So when I went back, I knew exactly where I got my particular fact from, and I can cross-check and so forth. The next thing I knew, I'd gone through 20, then 30, then 50, then 100 different sources, and it kept growing. And the next thing I knew, I had this enormous factual chronological database. Now, not every single fact that I put into my database turned out to be true. Mm-hmm. You have to judge and evaluate. But it turned out to be an incredibly useful exercise for me, because what I quickly saw was that most books on this topic are not constructed in a chronological way, not exactly. And by putting a lot of different sources in one huge database, I felt that I was able to see patterns that I might not have seen otherwise. Mm-hmm. For example, the connections between UFO cover-up and a lot of other covert types of activities that were going on in the United States in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. There seemed to be a lot of dovetailing that turned out to be useful when I was writing my book. Make a long story short, though, what started out as a pet project morphed into this 500-page book. A book that I wrote as a historical narrative. I tried to do as little opinion editorializing as I could, and I really tried in a detached way to write what seemed to be a factually based history. And that's the result. So the book, in a sense, asks a couple of basic questions. Is there a UFO phenomenon that's legitimate? The answer is yes. What is legitimate about it? Well, there are certain military documents, government documents that we have that cannot be argued. They are real. They indicate a phenomenon that doesn't have any conventional logical explanation, but yet seems to have existed, seems to have been taken seriously. Third question is, why was this a big deal? And one answer among several is that it involved a national security problem, which was there were many of these objects violating airspace that you just don't go in and violate. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the Oak Ridge nuclear facility or Los Alamos or innumerable Air Force bases, naval air stations, Army bases. Objects going in, seen visually, tracked at times on radar, sometimes both, attempted intercepts. How much more serious do you want to get in the context of the early Cold War? So once I really saw that there was this very, very big thing, I knew I was onto something that was big, it was important, and that I was not going to let go of.
Mm.
When you were following your studies on the Cold War, were you aware, before you came across any of this evidence for a UFO phenomenon, were you aware of the existing proposed reality of UFOs in terms of what is today known as the kind of fringe UFO community or the UFO abduction community? Were you aware of that? I mean, most people are aware, have some awareness of UFOs.
I had very little knowledge of any of that, Joe. I didn't even know really the full dimensions of the Roswell story. At that point in 1993, I had heard the word Roswell, the name Roswell, I really wouldn't have been able to tell you much of anything about it, to be honest with you. None of the names. As far as the abduction phenomenon, yes, I was aware of an alleged abduction phenomenon.